Imagine you wake up, cold autumn air escaping through the cracks in the walls, penetrating the brick and mortar that you call home. It's 1905, and outside you can just see the bustling streets of Little Italy, New York, begin to come to life as the day begins. You can hear the clicks of horse hose filling the industrial canyons, facilitating this energy. In the streets, busy men are rushing all around, some walking, others being pulled along in horse-drawn carriages. Meanwhile, markets below open for consumption, with a stocking of potatoes, grains, and special for today, some bell peppers. For many Americans in the early years of the 20th century, life was certainly still fairly substantive, still living mostly to survive. Nearly all of their energy being used up in long 12 to 16-hour workdays or in childbearing. However, this difficult, dangerous way of life at the time still was very much worth it, as all of the paying jobs were available only in industrial cities. So if you wanted one of those industrial jobs, you had to move both yourself and your family into the city and into the cramped living facilities, sometimes referred to as workhouses. But unbeknownst to you, on the horizon was an invention so significant it would flip the lifestyles of those wishing to be involved with the industrialized world on its head, giving way to more freedom, mobility, and personal agency along the way, bringing with it a cultural revolution that reshaped what it meant to be American. This is For the Future of Us All, Deep Dive, how the automobile revolutionized the American way of life.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is hard and we will accept.
Before we get started, we'd love it if you would hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Not only does it help us understand what kind of content you guys want to watch and are interested in, it also helps us with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks. Another word before we jump into this content. A lot of what we're talking about, the new experiences available to what we'll refer to as Americans, were in truth really only available to white Americans, as both through the GI Bill and multiple housing initiatives were denying access to African Americans and Asian Americans at the time, universally. A lot of these effects are still being felt in many major cities and rural areas in the country, where things such as new freeways have split communities in half and fundamentally fractured what it meant to be a citizen of that area. It's important we understand these effects are still being felt, and understanding where they come from and the histories of how they were implemented can help us not make these mistakes in the future. But with that in mind, let's now discuss how cars changed our lives so much. To understand the transition of automobiles from a plaything of the rich to the nearly universal tool we see today, let's quickly dive into how the car became the transporter of the common man. In 1885, in Germany, Carl Benz invented the automobile. And for the next 25 years or so, until roughly 1910, cars were very much exclusive to the rich. They were made by hand by shops called coach builders, and were yet to be seen as anything really more than a toy. That is until 1908, when Henry Ford changed everything. Called the Model T, his new design was constructed on an assembly line, which allowed the model at its lowest to only cost $260, and was famous for coming in, quote, any color as long as it's black, unquote. Of course, being built off the back of Henry Ford's desire to make his company as streamlined as possible. And this was just the beginning, as in the coming years, the car completely transforms not only American spending habits, but also fundamentally how they operate within their communities, as well as the broader economy. So first we'll look into the many social changes that the car brought about, from a more comfortable American home life to a slow leveling of the playing field between genders, again, mostly within white Americans' lives. Then we'll dive into how American landscapes and communal places were drastically changed as well. And much of this happened in a kind of linear advancement, meaning that as cars became more widely available and used, they also began to affect Americans' daily lives more and more. In fact, look through any real modern movie, TV show, or novel based in our current time frame, not featuring cars to some degree. Try to find it. Because alongside the explosion in popularity for cars, ownership in America, which went from roughly 8,000 in 1900 to 8 million in 1920, was the social revolution of suburbs, with many Americans at the time beginning to settle outside of the cities and suburbs. It became necessary for stay-at-home parents, mostly housewives at the time, to have a relatively quick mode of transport. And while it is true that the initial boom of domestic automobiles was mainly focused on shuttling domestic tasks such as children and groceries, within just a few decades, the automobile went from helping housewives shuttle those children and errands to advancing the role of women in the workplace, with younger generations harnessing the technology to even the playing field, giving personal transportation a sense of freedom and opportunity to all genders equitably. With this younger generation and into the 1960s, car ownership skyrocketed, gaining an additional 25 million cars within the United States, establishing a kind of culture of car pride and what many now remember as hot rods. Yet, even with all of the massive social change happening because of the automobile, it can't hold a candle to the amount of infrastructure change that occurred because of this revolution. This impact on both the rural and urban landscapes requires little to no imagination. Early in automobile infrastructure construction, highways were beginning to connect America's largest cities and the towns in between. Entire tourism industries were founded, from drive-in hotels, soon called motels or motor hotels, to restaurant chains, even some you may see around today, such as McDonald's or In-N-Out in California. This all inspired by the philosophy of personal transport and, quote, drive-through economics, describing the roadside scene now commonplace along American freeways. But drive-through luxuries weren't the only way the automobile rapidly changed America's landscape. Perhaps the largest single type of new business needed along these new highway systems in America were gas stations, or filling stations as they were called back then. Early in the car's life cycle, car owners had to purchase gas through what was called, quote, bulk deposits, essentially large cans of fuel, due to the complete lack of plumbing and infrastructure required to actually store and pump fuel. Which, going on a tangent, I literally never thought of all the work it took just to put gasoline in my car from a fuel station. I don't really understand what I thought was happening, but it is incredibly complicated. I mean, they got whole pump systems down there. It's really toxic, it's really flammable, so there's a lot of safety precautions. This is a really huge infrastructure overhaul. But back to old styles of fuel systems, these bulk deposits would be typically gravity fed, meaning the fuel was stored above where it would need to be let off, and typically out the back of a horse-drawn carriage. And the absolute terribleness of this idea eventually inspired the first proper gas station in the United States. The Automobile Gasoline Company in St. Louis used that gravity system, but stationary, to achieve that very feat in 1905. But of course, as car ownership exploded, one fuel station in the country wasn't going to cut it. So large corporations such as Standard Oil looked to take advantage of this by opening a change of 34 gas stations in 1914 along much of the West Coast, but it was much larger than just this. The boom in roadside business was huge, actually. A 1930s survey of roadside business from Newark to Trenton, New Jersey showed an astonishing 300 gas stations, 472 billboards, and over 440 other small businesses. This was a far larger impact than anyone saw coming, and revolutionized how American businesses were located within settlements, meaning they moved from within communities within downtown districts to alongside freeways built for travelers. Yes, it was genuinely more profitable, still is in some places. However, the automobile crisis wasn't all boom. Much of the change came in cultural busts. One of these many busts was the congestion of traffic control. This isn't even revolutionary to say, it sucks, and here's some, polling to prove it, as if you needed other people's opinions to tell you how much you hate traffic. However, much of this quote bust here comes in how the freeway projects that created the suburbs and modern road trip culture were created themselves. So let's look into that. And when you look at it, the Federal Aid to Highway Act of 1956 is the main culprit here. It has allowed the US government to both purposefully and unpurposefully drive highways and freeways through black and brown communities, taking homes by what is known as eminent domain, which is the right for US government agencies to expropriate private property for public use, with payment or compensation. A tangent should be noted here, however, that this compensation is rarely fair. Rarely. This targeting of these communities holistically was undeniably racist. The intention was to complete the highway system before the wave of civil rights and court cases began recognizing living equality as the law of the land. Yeah, yikes. In conclusion, the automobile and its surrounding economy certainly changed America permanently, both culturally and technologically and economically. It affected us in such a variety of ways, from quicker commute times to increased institutionalized racism, leaving its hateful mark. But with this complex history, what do you think? I'd love to know. How do you personally digest all these changes, and how do you balance the good versus the bad in this infrastructure project? And for the future of us all, we better get educated and find solutions.